The air is getting cooler, the leaves are starting to turn color, the footballs are flying, and an off-season full of exciting exhibitions and content can only mean one thing: the return of the NWBA. Notable change to the way Tera functions in the draft league. How will this affect the legacy of past and future Tera captains? Newcomers looking to take some names, old veterans coming back to stake their claims, breakouts, redemptions, all are at stake. We'll see who wants a piece of that championship pie. It's the Season 7 premiere of Wonder Room starting now. Wonder Room is brought to you in part by Booze Mobile and by Kurtz's Chicken. And now for your host, King Vasser. Hello everyone and welcome to the Season 7 premiere of Wonder Room. It's been some months since we last saw each other, but with Season 7 right around the corner, now is as good a time as any to bring back everyone's favorite NWBA show. Some things have changed between last season and this, mostly in the term of GMs, but overall, not nearly as much has turned over from Season 6 to 7, like from Season 5 to 6. There have been no DLC drops, no new Pokemon, anything like that, but that doesn't mean that important changes haven't happened between seasons. As a matter of fact, the first important change we need to talk about is regarding the rules of Tera captains. Last couple seasons, we've ran a very restrictive Tera policy, and while we are adopting that policy again this season, we have made some tweaks that are gonna spice things up just a little bit more in the upcoming season. For the sake of this explanation, we will be using two Tera captains from Season 6 as a demonstration: Tera and Scarlet. As per NWBA rules, every Tera captain gets two Tera types, one stab option and one non-stab option. Pretty decent, you know, covers a lot of bases, but this can in fact be a little restrictive. As we've kind of noticed, a lot of Pokemon have an issue where they want to utilize multiple Tera types, but being locked into a stab type doesn't always bode well. Tera, as an example, is typically used as a Shell Smasher on offense, but can have some defensive value. Neither of its stab options are really all that great for it. And then you look at Snorlax, which is almost entirely used defensively, whether it wants to be set up or not. That stab normal isn't really doing anything for it either. So how do you solve the issue of Tera captains not really wanting to use their stab option and really only having one Tera type available? Simple, you get rid of the stab designation. Starting in Season 7, Tera captains will have the option to have two types, but it doesn't matter if they're stab or not. So for a dual type like Tera, you could run both stabs as your Tera, or you could run neither. And for a Pokemon like Snorlax, which is only one type, you can have that stab option if you really wanted to, but you're not forced into it. This is going to open up the game tremendously, specifically for defensive Pokemon, but will definitely have an impact in Season 7, and it's going to be really interesting to see how much more playtime Tera as a whole is going to get as a result. Now let's get into the meat of today's episode, the tier shifts that have happened between Season 6 and 7. Obviously, every season, that's a big thing to look at where Mons are compared to where they were last season. Some Mons are going to drop down tiers, some Mons are going to raise up. And with the fact that we are well removed from both DLC releases, Smogon no longer operates on a monthly tier shift system, so the metagame has really settled down, but that doesn't mean that these changes aren't going to be seismic. There has been a considerable amount of movement between Season 6 and 7, especially among the lower tiers. Starting at the top of the list, we have the two Pokemon that are going to be banned in Season 7 that were available in Season 6, that being Gouging Fire and Volcarona. Neither Mon played too many games last season and didn't really do all too much in those games played, but they are Pokemon that get banned pretty often because you know how dangerous they can be. Volcarona has always been a complete menace to deal with, even in the face of rock types, and Gouging Fire having approximately 1738 different sets to sweep, and or otherwise break down your team, it should be no surprise to anyone that both of these Mons have been banned from Smogon between Season 6 and 7 and will be unavailable for the upcoming NWBA season. Moving on to Pokemon that will be legal for Season 7, we start with the Pokemon that have risen to OU through usage naturally, starting with Deoxys Speed. Had a double-double season last season for Snowbell City. Pretty solid effort. Didn't put up as many points as some were led to believe it would. We'll see if it being properly recognized as an OU Pokemon will change its fortunes on that front. The Ruby League MVP Iron Crown finds its way up to OU now after its 100-point season, meaning that it is going to be more resource heavy than ever to keep it as a Tera captain, so we will see if the drop-off is steep from season to season. Iron Moth finds its way back up to OU, was in OU in Season 5, dropped to UU in Season 6 under the employment of the Black Flame Razorfangs, but now finds its way back up to OU. As dangerous as ever, still really strong, good coverage. We'll see how it fares back in that spot. I'd imagine it won't miss a beat and will probably put up better numbers this season than it did last season. And then lastly, Moltres, which was on the Turnback Renegades last season, was actually an RU pick, but it's really good matchups, and a lot of the top tier Mons in OU have resulted in its rise straight to the top of the Smogon ladder. Was pretty much entirely used for defensive purposes last season. We'll see how that works this season, knowing that it's going to have to be one of a team's linchpins for the season. But those weren't the only Mons that found their way into OU. Of course, we have to talk about the Mons that were sent to the UUBL tier, which, as you all know, BL counts for the tier above for NWBA purposes. Starting with Garchomp. Last season was on Undella. Didn't play that many games. Had a pretty decent season. It will almost never put up the numbers it did at the very beginning of the NWBA, but is still a very, very good Mon, as evidenced by the fact that it pretty much dominated the UU tier when it was there. So that Mon returns to its roots in the OU tier. Como, one of the more slept on Mons last season, only played 4 games, didn't finish the season on a roster. This Mon can do so many different things, and yet it really wasn't used by anyone last season. Now that it is recognized as an OU Pokemon, will we see far more playing time? We are talking about a Pokemon that was an instrumental part of 2 championship rosters, being seasons 3 and 4. So Como cannot get overlooked by anybody and shouldn't heading into this season. And then lastly, you have Ursaluna, who was on Turnback last season. Decent amount of games, decent performance. This is a Pokemon that some of us have been theory crafting should have been banned from UU essentially from the very beginning. And yet, somehow, some way, it takes all the way till Season 7 for this Mon to finally get banished from UU, but now it is there. It is recognized as an OU Pokemon. Will that affect how much playing time it sees? That will remain to be seen, but all these Pokemon are certainly good enough that they were OU caliber. They just didn't put up the points. We'll see how that works going into Season 7. Next up, a couple of Mons that rose up to UU, starting with Cobalion. Was not used at all last season. It was not drafted, it was not picked up as a free agent, wasn't seen at all, which means it has yet to make its Gen 9 debut for the NWBA, but it was a very prominent Pokemon in Gen 8, was used as recently as Season 4, so hopefully the fact that it has risen up to UU means that this Mon will actually get a chance to shine and put some work in this season. And then we have Rhyperior, one of the more interesting cases of tier risers this season. Much like Moltres jumped up 2 tiers, this Mon was originally used in NU last season as a member of the Snowbell City Savants. Only played 4 games. King had to do a lot of maneuvering. He waffled on whether or not he wanted to make this thing a Tera captain or not. And now this thing has risen up 2 whole tiers to UU, so that decision is going to be that much more impactful if a GM has the same type of indecisiveness on whether or not to make Rhyperior, which overall is still a very solid Mon, a Tera captain or not. Moving on over to RUBO, we start with Blastoise, an interesting case, a Mon that no one really thought was going to be moving tiers at all, but you can never doubt Shell Smash offense, and it's not like there isn't already a Mon populating that tier, Poltegeist. So Blastoise, last season it was on Fuchsia City, was an integral part of their offense in the few games that it did play in, 32 points in just 10 games. Now this Mon has elevated up to RUBL. It will be interesting to see if it gets trapped in the Phantom Zone, so to speak, like Poltegeist has the past few seasons, or if Blastoise, with its added defensive utility, can actually find its way onto our roster spot. Hoopa Unbound, Thunderous T, Enamorous T, and Iron Leaves all find their way back up to UU by technicality after spending a season down in RU. Varying seasons of success. Hoopa Unbound, part of Kiram's legacy last season. Pretty solid performance, 36 points in 18 games. Thunderous T, an MVP candidate for Undella last season, putting up 77 points in 42 games played. Through 2 seasons, Thunderous T has been one of the most prolific Pokemon in the NWBA as far as Gen 9 is concerned. We'll see if that success can continue for a 3rd season. Enamorous Therian, decent numbers, nothing too crazy. Was an okay part of Heart Home's offense last season. Iron Leaves, which went unrostered in Season 6, wasn't drafted either, was last seen in Season 5 as a part of the Veilstone Valiants. And then lastly, Zarude, another Pokemon that was not rostered in Season 6 or drafted, was part of Newbark Town in Season 5. As a matter of fact, arguably their most important Pokemon. So all of these Pokemon very solid. We'll see whether or not they will find their way onto a roster again in Season 7, because again, RUBL is kind of that tier, the weird in between, where people start looking at this Mon like, we don't really need to employ its talents. So there's a case that at least one of these Mons isn't going to see playing time in Season 7. Our biggest group of risers comes from those who go from NU to RU. 10 different Mons saw themselves elevating up to the middle of the road tier with varying degrees of success in the previous season. Necrozma, Overquell being the 2 most prolific for Undella and Legacy, respectively. Armarouge, Crocodile, Magnezone, Noivern, and Thunderous Eye all seeing some playing time last season. Armarouge and Magnezone unfortunately finishing unrostered, but at least they fared a little bit better than Chansey, Slowbro, and Reuniclus, who didn't see any playing time last season, were not rostered at all, weren't even drafted. In the case of Reuniclus, we still haven't seen this Mon make its Generation 9 debut. At the very least, we've seen Chansey and Slowbro in Season 5, so we know what they're capable of defensively. All these Mons are pretty solid. We'll see how this fares. There are a lot of Mons that just didn't really get a fair shake because there were just too many bodies in NU. Now that RU has been completely reshaped, I'd like to think that all these Mons are at the very least going to get some consideration for playing time, if not actually find their way into being a decent and potentially even crucial part of a roster in the upcoming season. And for our final group of risers, we have those that were banned from NU, so they count as RU Mons for the upcoming season. A very interesting case of the have and the have-nots. We'll start with the haves. Lucario and Mew, without question, the 2 best Mons in NU last season. They were both first-team All-NWBA, both putting up 60-plus point seasons. Lucario as a member of Legacy, and Mew as a member of Pursuit Live. It seems the non-draft world has caught up to what these 2 Mons are capable of, which is why that you see those 2 get banned. Gyarados and Lycanroc Dusk both put up decent stats last season, didn't play too many games, but were able to score more than 1 point per game, which is always nice to see. Gyarados unfortunately finishing unrostered. Lycanroc Dusk, another part of Pursuit Live. Both of these Mons are Mons that can get behind the steering wheel and take a team to victory. We've seen it before, especially Lycanroc Dusk, one of the top 10 most prolific offensive Pokemon in the Generation 8 era of the NWBA, so we'll see how that works. They're still hanging around what is considered a lower tier. That's a lot of value that's on the table. And lastly, we get into Cloyster and Gallade, 2 Pokemon that were not picked up last season. Gallade we haven't seen since Season 4 was on a turn-back Renegades roster that made it to the NWBA Finals. But Cloyster, the most interesting case of any rising Pokemon, we haven't seen this Mon in action since Season 2. And for what it's worth, this is a Mon that's kind of typically seen as a gimmick, using that King's Rock skill link cheese to pick up KOs. And with King's Rock not being a legal item in the NWBA, hasn't been for a while because it hasn't been legal in OU, we have no idea if this Mon is even going to get rostered this season. So it might be a case where Cloyster's time in the sun has completely faded away, but there's always a chance. It is a shell smasher. We know how that's gone in league history. Anything can happen once that white herb, that focus sash, that whatever you want gets placed and the big red button gets pressed. We take you now to the Pokemon that found themselves dropping tiers between generations. Important to note that's not always necessarily a bad thing. Some Pokemon are just not meant to be as high usage as they are and would fare much better in a non-ladder format in a lower tier, especially when you consider the way that Tera works in our league. And we've got two pretty wild Pokemon to drop from OU. We start with Superior, was a member of the Snowpoint Ceaseless Edgers last season. Didn't play in that many games, didn't put up that many points either. Superior, a classic case of a Pokemon that we figured once this thing drops to a lower tier, it's going to get way better because it doesn't require as much resources and becomes an actual viable option for being a Tera Captain. And we just gotta say, we think that this Pokemon could be absolutely disgusting as a Tera Captain. And then we have Torkoal, a really interesting case. Put up pretty good numbers for Fuchsia City last season, enabling that Sun offense. And it's for that exact reason that we're surprised that this Pokemon dropped at all. Sun has been so prevalent throughout the entirety of Scarlet Violet that we figured, oh, there's no way Torkoal is ever going to drop from OU. Not with all those demons up there running around in OU. And yet, here we are, and this Pokemon drops down to UU, which means running a Sun team is going to be a lot easier because you don't have to invest an OU pick into the Sunsetter. Granted, there are other Sunsetters around now, Ninetales, but that doesn't mean that Torkoal dropping to UU isn't going to have massive implications on how someone is going to build their team in Season 7. 4 Pokemon found their way down to RU after being in UU last season. And we just talked about how Torkoal dropping is a huge boost for Sun teams. Let's talk about the fact that Barraskewda, the Rain Merchant, the Swift Swimmer in competitive, has now found its way down to RU. It was the offense for Lava Ridge Town last season, so anyone looking to build a Rain team in Season 7 is going to enjoy the fact that one of the most important offensive pieces of any Rain team is down in a middle tier. Jirachi and Weezing G both had very good seasons last season. Weezing G, as a member of Turnback, put up a 2020 season. Jirachi, as a member of Legacy, putting up a 60-point season, 34 KOs, a myriad of stored power sets ranging from standard to holy hell, we have to get this guy out of our league now. And then lastly, Gudra H, which didn't have a great season. It's always going to be more of a defensive Mon, but you never want to see any Pokemon put up negative points. But still a very solid Mon in its own right, and will more likely than not fare much better down in RU. On to the Pokemon that fell down to NU, we start with Araquanid, one of the better sticky web setters in the format, as you can tell by the fact that it's not in PU. 24 games played for DreamYard last season, only -7 points. I know only seems weird there, but you have to consider this a Pokemon whose job it was to literally set webs and then get the hell out of the way. So the fact that it put up KOs and assists is still pretty good. Then you have Breloom, a member of Kitakami last season, one of the biggest losers from the Sleep Move ban. This thing has continued dropping and dropping. But we are talking about a Pokemon with base 130 attack, so just because it can't put things to sleep anymore doesn't mean that this Mon can't put in some work. Next up, we have Chinchino, which was a big part of Kurowa's roster last season. 37 games played. Tidy up offense, still pretty potent. Yeah, it's not going to be the most threatening thing in the world, even after one boost, but that's still a really good move and still provides some good utility for any roster. Cresselia, one of the more prominent defensive Pokemon in the NWBA, finds itself down here now after spending a season in RU as a member of Slitherwing Sicily. And then lastly, Indeedee Male, the only Pokemon to drop multiple tiers between seasons. It was in UU last season, which was a big reason why it only played 2 games and didn't finish the season rostered. It just wasn't good enough to justify its tiering. We knew that it was up there because of the size spam that it enabled. Now it is properly dropped down to NU, back where it was at one point in Season 8, and back where it will likely become an actual contributing member of a roster yet again. Now, of course, as we all know, with every impending DLC or any other type of event like a Pokemon Home update where a mass amount of Pokemon gets introduced into a gen, a lot of those Pokemons are going to find themselves all the way down at PU, and as a result, 45 different Pokemon have been demoted down to the lowest tier as far as the NWBA is concerned from Season 6 to Season 7. Now, of course, that also means that there are a lot of pretty solid Pokemon that still do pretty good things that are all the way down here. We'll start with a group of Pokemon that we have seen in Season 6. A lot of names here. The Tera Captain Ambipom, the, some would say, captain of the Season 6 champion Casquafa Cyndaquil's Goodra. Other very valuable Pokemon down here, Venusaur, Screamtail, Milotic, Copperajah, Pokemon that we've seen get a lot of games and Pokemon that we've seen succeed in seasons past, Mons like Gastrodon, Kingdra. So even though these Pokemon find themselves down here, that doesn't mean that their chances of ever being relevant in the league is over. There's still plenty of opportunity to be found, and again, because of the way the Tera system works, a lot of these Mons can be really, really nasty Tera Captains for just 1 point apiece. Next up, the list of Mons that were seen in Season 5, so at the very least we know what they can do in Generation 9. 10 of these Mons, some of them were extremely prolific in Season 5. Mudsdale was an all-NWBA member. Staraptor and Tauros Paldean Aqua and Tauros Paldean Blaze were both very good offensive Pokemon for their team. And ultimately, all these Mons saw a decent amount of use. Most of them were higher than NU the last time we actually saw them in action, which would explain why they got playing time. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're doomed to never see the field again, just that they dropped a PU for a reason. But much like we said with the last group of Pokemon, there's still a lot of value to be found here, especially as Tera Captains. And so you'll probably see some of these Pokemon hit the field one way or another in the upcoming season. And wrapping up the Pokemon that have shifted tiers, we have Pokemon that fell to PU that we have not yet seen in Gen 9. Now that doesn't mean that we've never seen any of these Pokemon. There are a few Pokemon that we have seen in the past. Mons like Duraludon, Golurk, Ninetales that have proven their worth back in the Generation 8 days of the NWBA. But there are also Pokemon like Flamigo, Bellibolt that are Gen 9 Pokemon and just haven't gotten to see the light of day. This is also where you'll find the widest range of Pokemon that are actually considered to be quote-unquote usable by most people. Something like Altaria, Colossal, Quillfish have defensive value. Then you have Pokemon like, well, Smeargle and Gligar, which, I mean, let's be completely honest. If you're using these Pokemon, it's because you like these Pokemon, not because you think they're actually bringing something to your team that another Pokemon can't do, but better. But at the end of the day, that's the beauty of PU Mons. Some people just like to pick the Mons that they like, and sometimes it works. A lot of times it doesn't, but beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and as always, skill is in the eye of the player. So, some of these Mons, you might get to see in Season 7. We will just have to wait and see how things shake out. And now we move on to the final segment of today's episode, the GM introductions. As per usual, the most interesting part, arguably, of the NWBA season is who's actually playing in the league. And this season, once again, we have a very interesting crop of GMs. Not nearly as many newcomers as we did last time. Instead, having more veterans coming back, but some very surprising names entering for Season 7, as you are about to see. As per usual, we run these things in alphabetical order, so we'll start with 2010 AZ. One of the more unique entrants in NWBA history. Doesn't have any experience in this league, but is familiar with the draft league format despite never having joined any in the past. Pretty solid ladder player, 1500 to 1700 point range. What's unique about them is that they discovered this league through this very show. Wonder Room has actually had some type of influence out in the world, and as a result, we have someone who isn't particularly a viewer of our commissioner or someone who knows our commissioner and yet found their way into the NWBA regardless, so that's always interesting to see. Next up, another newcomer, but someone who should be a little bit more familiar to NWBA fans. Aleph Sub-Zero, who was the coach of Galarian Blades in Season 6, does have draft league experience, is a pretty high ladder player, one of the few players who actually was able to say they're 1700 points or higher on the ladder. It's going to be interesting to see how they perform this season. We know that Blades was the coach of Nico in Season 5, and Aleph was the coach of Blades in Season 6, and both of those teams finished at 16-6. That's a high bar to set for any player, but just based on the evidence that we have in the past, it wouldn't be surprising if Aleph comes out here and is able to put up a pretty good performance in their first season. Following that, one of the fan favorites in NWBA history returns for a second season. Ball Heat is back. Went 13-8-1 last season, pretty good. Was out in league semis, could have went a little bit farther. A lot of people wanted to see him go all the way, but proved his worth as a pretty solid NWBA player in his first season. Exciting to see what type of nonsense he's going to be up to this time around, especially knowing his performances in Primetime. He is undefeated on Versus Seekers, so it's more likely than not that you're going to see plenty more of his crazy sets and his weird antics in the season to follow. And then comes a veteran that we haven't seen since Season 1. Young Beku, better known as just Beku, has finally made his return to the NWBA landscape. Was 5-16 in his lone season as a player. It has been a long time since we've seen him play Mons in any aspect. Isn't a competitive Pokemon player. This league is the only experience he really has in it, but he thinks now is a good time to come back, get his feet wet yet again, and see what type of damage he can do this time around in a completely different generation, in a completely new landscape that he finds himself in. Moving on over to Galarian Blades. We mentioned earlier he went 16-6 in his first season as an NWBA GM. It's going to be interesting to see how he does in his follow-up performance. It's already rare enough to see a player put up that type of record and make it all the way to a league finals in their first season as a GM. A very tough act to follow, but if Nico is any indication, Blades might be due for an improvement and is on the short list of true championship contenders heading into Season 7, at least on paper. We mentioned earlier that Ball Heat was one of the fan favorites, but he is not the only GM in contention for funniest battler of all time. In comes CJ back for a third season in the NWBA. Went 6-16 in both of his first two seasons as a GM. Not a fantastic record, but we have seen improvement from CJ from season to season. At this point, third time's got to be the charm, right? The team has been improved. The plays are slowly getting better. He just needs to find a way to put it all together, and it wouldn't be a surprise to anyone if CJ's actually able to make some things shake this time around. Moving on to another one of Blades associates, we have Earthflax, who familiarized himself with the NWBA landscape last season with quite a interesting bit of banter. Has had draft league experience, is relatively high on the ladder We don't really know much else about this guy. Hasn't really spoken much at all. Only really was around for a week or two during the season. So one of the true wild cards of the league. We have no idea what to expect out of this guy heading into season 7. But if there's anything we know about the NWBA, it's that it's a place of opportunity, and one person looking to capitalize on that chance is Flair, back for a second season. Went 3-19 last season, had the worst record in the NWBA, but looked a lot better than a lot of teams that are in contention for relegation typically end up. A lot of close sets, almost knocked off our reigning champion Keg in the last week of the season, which would have eliminated him from the playoffs entirely. So just because Flair didn't have a good time last go around doesn't mean that they can't flip the switch and make something shake this go around. Moving on over to another one of our newcomers, this time it's Keith. A fan of the NWBA, doesn't have draft league experience and doesn't have much competitive singles experience, but he is a member of the Max Chord, and the track record as far as all the players that we've seen over there go, we have no idea what to expect out of Keith. He could dominate and get all the way to NWBA finals. He could win like 2 sets. We really don't know. Again, one of the true wild cards heading into season 7. What we do know is that a lot of those guys are up to some pretty heinous stuff. So again, will be really funny to see what Keith tries to bring to the table. But we move on from wild cards to the closest thing to a sure bet as possible in this league. It's the return of Kobe. 5 seasons of NWBA experience. This being his 6th means that he is now moved into sole possession of first place for most seasons by an NWBA GM. A stellar career record. He's made it to an NWBA finals before. He's the only GM in league history to win 20 or more sets in multiple seasons. All that's missing from his trophy cabinet is that championship. Will season 7 be the one? We'll have to wait and see. But if there's anybody who could walk away as the de facto favorite of this league to win, it's got to be this man. Yet another South Carolinian has decided to throw their hat into the fray. Like an egg comes rolling in, a known friend of CJ and Nico, whose ability to outreach has been a big part of why the NWBA has been able to grow in Generation 9. Has some draft league experience, has some competitive singles experience. Again, a wild card. We don't really know what they're going to bring to the table, but it's always interesting to see people bring their friends into the fray. We'll see if Nico or CJ has more of an influence on this player, or if either have any at all. Again, we have no idea what to expect from this person. But you will know what to expect coming from this person. Nico is back for his 3rd season in the NWBA. 36-8 in his first 2 seasons. That is as good a record as it's going to get for any player over a 2-season stretch. We've never seen someone really be able to be this great in their first 2 seasons. Nico making it to the final 8 in his first season, and then making it all the way to the NWBA finals where he lost in the final game last season. He's back for redemption. You know he's back for redemption. And at this point, it's championship or bust. And you can't blame the guy. Again, on the short list of players to be considered a favorite to be champion in Season 7. Moving on to one of the more inexperienced players coming into this draft league, we have Seri Nomi. Hasn't joined a draft league before, but is familiar with the format. Doesn't have that much competitive singles experience. Again, with so many newcomers, it is hard to tell who's going to be who, what's going to be what. But it's always nice to see people willing to get a little uncomfortable. Might not necessarily know their way around competitive Pokemon that well, but the fact that they're willing to show up in the NWBA means that they're here for a good time. At the end of the day, that's all that really matters. So we welcome Seri with open arms anyway, and excited to see what they're going to bring to the table in this season. In comes another veteran looking to redeem themselves in a sort of way. It's Will returning for his 5th season in the NWBA, one of the more established veterans that we have in league history. In his previous 4 seasons, he is a combined 40-40. Perfectly balanced, as all things should be, and still looking to match his heights from season 1, where he made it all the way to the NWBA finals. Missed the playoffs last go around, but a season off has refreshed his mind, and he's got another strategy ready to go. He knows what he wants to do. It's just a matter of executing this time around, and it wouldn't be a surprise to anyone if Will is able to make it back to those heights that he saw early in his career. We move along to yet another player who decides to run it back for a second season. Zach has decided to come back after his 6-15-1 campaign last season. Not a great record, but it's important to note that Zach wasn't exactly the most locked in person last season. We see that from time to time. Sometimes your focus gets diverted to other things, and it is important to note that Zach started off the season undefeated, went 3-0 in his first week in Season 6. So, if Zach can take that play and keep that focus over the course of the entire season, we're talking about one of the better players in the league. So, we'll see just how improved Zach can make his record, but it wouldn't surprise anyone to see that guy in playoff contention. And last but not least, we have Z, one of the gamblers of all time, running it back for a second season. Went 9-13 last season. Experienced one of the best in-season turnarounds in NWB history. Started off the season really poorly, only won one set in his first 3 weeks, and then really turned it up in the back half. Play got a lot better, luck got a lot better too, and was one set away from taking Keg's spot in the playoffs instead. So there is a timeline out there where Z is your Season 6 NWBA champion. Does that mean that he's going to pull that off this season? Who's to say? What we do know is that Z is a good player, and if his luck is better like it was in the back half of last season, who knows what he gets done this time around. That's going to do it for this week's episode. Thank you all for watching. I've been your host, King Vasser. The Season 7 draft is going to take place on Dom's channel in just a little bit, so stick around and stay tuned for more NWBA content coming your way very soon.